The period of time between the Great Depression and the end of the 1960s was a difficult and volatile one for the amusement industry. Many classic parks were shut down, and an even greater number of roller coasters were lost to history. Just when it seemed like the world had lost interest in the roller coaster, the debut of a thrilling new ride at an exciting new park in 1972 breathed life into the industry, renewing public interest in the parks that had entertained patrons for nearly a century. This coaster was the catalyst of new things to come, a new coaster golden age, the roller coaster renaissance. Before we dive into the 70s coaster renaissance, we need to back it up a bit, specifically to swingin' 1961. While countless local amusement parks were struggling to make a profit in this era, Walt Disney was raking in boatloads of cash at his wildly successful Disneyland park. Unlike a traditional amusement park, Disneyland guests paid an admission price before entering the park, where they were met with fantastical themed lands and attractions. The Disneyland experience had an impact on many, but perhaps none more so than Angus G. Wynn Jr., a real estate developer who looked out upon Walt's-themed lands and saw not just a world of fantasy and intrigue, but a world of profits. Armed with this inspiration, and a good amount of money from New York investors, Angus set out to build a themed amusement park in his home state of Texas, as there's no other state a man with the name Angus G. Wynn Jr. can be from. The park opened in 1961 as Six Flags Over Texas, with 6 lands themed to each of the 6 entities that had governed Texas in its history. The park was a huge success, attracting over 500,000 guests in its first 45 days of operation alone. Meanwhile, the crew at Aerodynamics had been spending the early 60s tinkering with their new steel coaster concept. While the Matterhorn bobsled's prototype had been a success, Aero spent years refining and improving the concept, and by 1966, were ready to unveil their creation to the world. The coaster opened at a relatively new park named, you guessed it, Six Flags Over Texas, as Runaway Mine Train. With trains themed to ore cars and an exciting layout with quick drops, dark tunnels, and 3 lift hills, the ride was a favorite amongst parkgoers. Other parks wanted in on the action, and Aero began cranking out more mine train coasters, installing a Dahlonega Mine Train at the brand new Six Flags Over Georgia in 1967, Cedar Creek Mine Ride at the still-kicking Cedar Point in 1969, and Gold Rusher at another brand new theme park in California named Magic Mountain in 1971. While Aero's steel mine train coasters were quite popular, they are not considered to be the catalyst of the coaster renaissance. That honor instead goes to a wooden coaster built by a firm that you'll be sure to recognize if you watched any of the other videos in this series. Yes, it's time to welcome back good old PTC and introduce their groundbreaking 1972 creation, the Racer. At the end of the 1971 season, Cincinnati's Coney Island, a park that had operated since 1886, shut down for good. However, the park did not close for the same reason as other shuttered traditional parks. It was doing well, drawing large crowds and making good money. But the park's unfortunate location on the banks of the Ohio River left it prone to flooding and with little room to expand, and Coney Island had seen its fair share of tragedies over the years. The solution was to move most of the park's rides to another location 25 miles north of Cincinnati, opening as a new, full-fledged theme park named Kings Island in 1972. While the new theme parks opening around this time were quite popular, all the modern thrills in the world could not replace the nostalgic charm of parks like Coney Island, and the developers of Kings Island were well aware of this. Instead of opening with a brand new steel coaster from Aerodynamics, Kings Island instead opened with an electrifying wooden coaster called the Racer. Designed by John C. Allen, the man behind Cedar Point's Blue Streak and president of the Philadelphia Toboggan Company, this dual-track racing coaster was marketed as the world's fastest and longest roller coaster, and received an unprecedented amount of attention from both the media and the general public. Located in the park's Old Coney section, where many of Coney Island's classic rides were moved, the ride was oozing with charm, with a layout reminiscent of the classic coasters that once populated the country. Other theme parks wanted in on the wooden coaster action, and PTC and the crew remained busy throughout the decade, constructing the Great American Scream Machine at Six Flags Over Georgia, The racer-inspired Rebel Yell at the brand new Kings Dominion theme park in Virginia and Thunder Road at a new park in North Carolina named Carowinds, as well as Screamin' Eagle at the third Six Flags park, Six Flags Over Mid-America, located near St. Louis, Missouri. In 1976, John Allen retired from his role as president, and the Philadelphia Toboggan Company stopped designing roller coasters, making Screamin' Eagle their final creation. While PTC is not involved in coaster construction today, they still manufacture coaster trains, which can be found on many modern-day wooden coasters. With John Allen having hung up the proverbial cleats, parks had to look elsewhere to purchase massive wooden coasters. Many turned to Bill Cobb, a designer who formerly worked with PTC as a structural engineer. Cobb's first solo design may also have been his most famous in the Texas Cyclone. Built at Houston's Astroworld amusement park in 1976, the ride was a modern, Texas-sized take on Coney Island's famous Cyclone coaster. Upon opening, many considered it to be the greatest coaster ever constructed, with airtime so forceful that seatbelts had to be added to the back seat in addition to the lap bars as an added precaution. Over the years, the Texas Cyclone was reprofiled to make it less intense and more palatable to the general public, and the ride eventually closed with the park in 2005. Other notable Cobb design coasters include Tornado at Adventureland in Iowa, the defunct Rolling Thunder at Great Adventure in New Jersey, Judge Roy's Scream at Six Flags Over Texas, and the massive Le Monstre at La Ronde in Montreal, Canada. Other parties got in on the wooden coaster craze as well. In 1978, International Amusement Devices, the new name for National Amusement Device, built the iconic dual-tracked Colossus at Magic Mountain. 1981 saw the opening of American Eagle at Marriott's Great America theme park. This twin coaster was made by a Raine manufacturer who was new to the coaster building business, a Swiss firm named International Amusement Installations, more commonly known by their acronym Intamin. Don't worry, we'll talk more about them later. Kings Island found themselves in the rather difficult position of having to one-up their hit racer roller coaster. With John Allen retired, Kings Island designed the ride in-house and enlisted the talents of a man named Charles Dinn to build the beast of a coaster they envisioned, aptly named the Beast. At nearly 7,400 feet, it's still the longest wooden coaster ever made, and features an incredibly unique layout for the time with underground tunnels, helices, and multiple lift hills. 6 years later, Charles Dinn was enlisted to supervise the relocation of the Rocket, a 1945 Herbert Paul Schmeck designed coaster from Playland Park in Texas to Knoebels in Pennsylvania. Before 1985, not only were people unaware that it was cost-effective to relocate a wooden coaster, they didn't even know it was possible. Dinn proceeded to help relocate 2 more coasters. The Schmeck designed Giant Coaster from Paragon Park in Massachusetts to Maryland's Wild World, where it still operates today as Wild One, and Skyliner, a John Allen designed coaster from New York's Roseland Park to Pennsylvania's Lakemont Park. In the latter half of the decade, Dinn teamed up with a designer named Curtis D. Summers, and the pair went on to build many wooden coasters, including Geauga Lake's Riverview Bob's-inspired Raging Wolf Bobs, Timberwolf at Worlds of Fun in Missouri, and the defunct Hercules at Dorney Park in Pennsylvania. Dinn and Summers finished off the decade with a bang, building the massive Texas Giant at Six Flags Over Texas for the 1990 season. The Renaissance years were great for wooden coaster fans, proving that the old-style rides were still as popular as ever. But the success of Arrow's early mine train coasters caught the eye of many amusement firms, all who were eager to tap into the potentially lucrative steel coaster market. The degree of innovation that followed would come to define the Renaissance years, and helped lay the groundwork for the amusement industry we know of today. While Arrow's mine trains were dominating the late 60s, a few manufacturers began producing compact steel coaster models, which proved to be very popular with both permanent amusement parks as well as traveling shows like fairs and festivals. A German engineer by the name of Anton Schwarzkopf began producing the Wildcat series of models in 1965, with his first opening at Gröna Lund in Sweden as Radar. A total of 33 of these models were built all over the globe, with 8 still operating today. Schwarzkopf followed up his Wildcat model with a Jetstar model in 1968, a model so popular that it got 2 sequels, in the Jetstar 2 model and the Jetstar 3 or Jumbo Jet model. Another popular compact coaster model from the 60s was the Zyklon model, produced by the Italian manufacturer Pinfari. Variations of this model can still be found at parks all over the world, from Ukraine to Iraq to even New Jersey. In the early 70s, Arrow continued to sell their mine train coasters to parks in North America. Carowinds got one, Great Adventure got one, even the Sweetest Place on Earth got one. But by the mid-1970s, Arrow was ready to tackle something that hadn't been attempted in nearly 100 years, adding an inversion to a roller coaster. If you recall from the first video in this series, Coney Island's Flip-Flap Railway was a massive failure. Things had changed a lot in 90 years, namely, they had technology. Through the use of computer-aided coaster design and breakthroughs in steel-bending tech, Arrow had everything they needed to make history. Engineers at the firm had been tinkering with a loop concept for years, but opted instead to install a barrel roll-like corkscrew inversion on their first inverting coaster. The ride opened as Corkscrew at Knott's Berry Farm in 1975. An uninspired name, yes, but a coaster that would inspire a revolution, literally. 1 year after the debut of Corkscrew, California's Magic Mountain opened the Revolution, the world's first modern roller coaster to contain a vertical loop. The ride was designed by none other than Anton Schwarzkopf, and built by the ride company Intamin, who handled the installation of all of Schwarzkopf's rides outside of Germany. Revolution was a massive milestone for Schwarzkopf, who was mostly known for his smaller traveling steel coasters, and drew in massive crowds. But don't let the Revolution make you think that Arrow was behind the curve. Exactly 1 week after the premiere of Revolution, Cedar Point opened Corkscrew, the first coaster to contain 3 inversions, a pair of corkscrews, and, you guessed it, a vertical loop. These looping coasters were incredibly successful, and Arrow and Schwarzkopf would spend the next decade trying to outdo one another, steadily increasing the size of their coasters and the number of inversions on them. Luckily for them, parks around the world all wanted in on the excitement, and were willing to shell out the cash needed for the latest in coaster technology. "1977 saw the opening of Super Duper Looper at Hershey Park in Pennsylvania, Schwarzkopf's follow-up to Revolution. That same year, Arrow and Schwarzkopf premiered their shuttle loop coasters. On a shuttle coaster, a train is propelled through a series of elements before reversing direction and traversing the same stretch of track backwards. While both Arrow and Schwarzkopf developed shuttle loop models, they operated very differently. Schwarzkopf's first shuttle loop opened as King Cobra at King's Dominion. The ride's train was launched through a vertical loop and up a 138-foot tall spike, where the train would lose momentum and fall backwards, traversing the loop again, whizzing through the station, and heading up a smaller rear spike before falling backwards into the station, where passengers would exit the ride. The train was launched via a weight drop system, with later models using a less complicated and more efficient flywheel system. Currently operating Schwarzkopf shuttle loops include Catapult at Hopi Hari in Brazil, which is actually where King's Dominion's original King Cobra was relocated, Montezuma's Revenge at Knott's Berry Farm, and this insane variation of the model found today at Selva Magica in Mexico as Bullet. Originally built in 1982 for the Austrian park Wiener Prater, this was Schwarzkopf's attempt at a portable shuttle loop model. It unfortunately never caught on, and only one model was ever built. Arrow's shuttle loop was much more bizarre, but no less thrilling. Instead of 2 spikes on the opposite end of the track to reverse the train's direction, Arrow's design had 2 horizontal stretches of track on each end, thus forcing riders to climb 5 stories to the loading platform. Upon boarding the train, riders were launched out of the station via a cable system, before suddenly dropping and entering a vertical loop. The train then climbed to a horizontal stretch of track where it briefly stopped, before being propelled backwards through the course. The first of these models to open to the public was Demon at Kings Island in 1977. A few Arrow shuttle loops still operate today, including Diamondback at Frontier City in Oklahoma, and Revolution at Blackpool Pleasure Beach in the UK. 1978 was a big year for both companies. Schwarzkopf stepped up their game in a big way, opening 2 of their most well-known looping coasters. The first was Mindbender at Six Flags Over Georgia, a unique terrain coaster featuring 2 loops and a diving helix. The second was Shockwave at Six Flags Over Texas, famous for its ultra-intense back-to-back vertical loops. With its location next to Interstate 30, rumor has it that Shockwave's impressive loops were the cause of many accidents soon after its opening due to distracted drivers. Arrow, as usual, was not one to be upstaged. 1978 saw the opening of perhaps their most famous looping coaster, Loch Ness Monster at Busch Gardens in Williamsburg, Virginia. The ride's standout feature is, obviously, its interlocking loops over the park's Rhine River. Nessie was the first coaster ever to feature this element, and is still the only ride in the world with it today. Arrow also built a coaster at Cedar Point in 1978, but it wouldn't be a custom looping coaster as the park already had one in Corkscrew. Instead, Arrow opened what was marketed at the time as the tallest and fastest coaster on the planet. That ride was Gemini, and it wasn't actually the tallest or fastest coaster on the planet, but it was undeniably fun. A hybrid coaster featuring steel running rails with wooden supports. Cars raced side by side along nearly 4,000 feet of track. The ride was an interesting deviation for Arrow, who had been building almost solely looping coasters since 1975. For 1979, let's take a break from Arrow and Schwarzkopf as two new companies were about to enter the steel coaster battleground. The first is one you've already heard of, Intamin. After helping Schwarzkopf build and install coasters for the past decade, the manufacturer was ready to tackle their first solo project, and it would be at one of the most famous parks in the world, Cedar Point. Intamin would open the revered Junior Gemini, a kiddie coaster known today as Wilderness Run. Hey, you gotta start somewhere, right? We'll be talking a lot more about Intamin later, so it's worth mentioning Junior Gemini here. The other company that broke onto the scene in '79 was Vekoma, a Dutch ride manufacturing company. Vekoma was originally contracted by Arrow to help build their rides in Europe. Just like Intamin, however, Vekoma eventually licensed its own coaster building technology and began to design and install their own coasters. Unlike Intamin's Junior Gemini, however, Vekoma's first coaster was a much grander endeavor. Named Tornado and located at Walibi, Belgium, Vekoma wore their Arrow influence proudly, as Tornado featured a very similar track and train design to Arrow's looping coasters. Vekoma would continue to build looping coasters throughout Europe in the early 80s, including the defunct Corkscrew at Alton Towers in the UK, Python at Efteling in the Netherlands, and Big Loop at Hyde Park in Germany. Finally, 1979 saw the return of the company that built the first major steel roller coaster, the Japanese firm Togo, who threw their hat into the looping coaster arena by building the aptly named Loop Coaster for Yomiuri Land in Tokyo. As the world entered a new decade, the novelty of looping coasters had begun to wear out. While 1980 saw the opening of Demon at California's Great America, the first coaster to go upside down 4 times, parkgoers were eager for something more exciting, and steel coaster manufacturers hit the drawing boards and began experimenting. Unsurprisingly, the designer to step up to the challenge was none other than Arrow. After years of development, Kings Island opened the Bat, Arrow's prototype suspended coaster. The ride featured 7-car trains that hung from a track overhead, with the cars freely capable of swinging side to side around turns. This coaster was a ride unlike anything the world had ever seen, and offered a completely unique coastering experience. However, it also offered a uniquely nightmarish experience for Kings Island's maintenance staff. The Bat was plagued with technical issues from day one, with problems arising so frequently that Arrow engineers were staffed at the ride station at all times. The issues mainly boil down to the lack of banking on the ride's turns and the degree of vehicle swing, adding unforeseen stress on the track and trains. After operating on and off for 2 years, Kings Island closed the Bat in 1984. Arrow was not finished with their suspended coaster model though. They learned plenty from the disaster at Kings Island and solved many of the technical problems that brought it down, eventually developing their Suspended Coaster 2.0. 2 of these new and improved suspended coasters opened in 1984, the iconic Big Bad Wolf at Busch Gardens Williamsburg, and what I consider to be one of history's worst named coasters, Accelerate, at Houston's Astroworld, although its name would probably be applauded by 2000's pop star Avril Lavigne. 9 of Arrow's Mark II suspended coasters were built, and 5 still operate today. Arrow wasn't the only one innovating though. Over in Japan, Togo was cooking up a new train design that was sure to turn people on their heads, or rather their feet. Remember Tokyo's Loop Coaster? In 1982, Togo installed a new train on the coaster designed to allow passengers to stand throughout the duration of the ride, and the first stand-up coaster was born. This admittedly gimmicky new technology soon made its way to North America. 1 year later in 1983, Arrow added stand-up trains to its corkscrew coaster at Kansas City's Worlds of Fun named Scream Roller, giving it the new name Extreme Roller. In 1984, Kings Island, who was quite the pioneering park during this era, opened King Cobra. This Togo creation was the first purpose-built stand-up coaster. Intamin got on the stand-up coaster trend in 1986, opening Shockwave at Magic Mountain, which at this point had been purchased by Six Flags. While built by Intamin, the ride was actually designed by a Swiss firm named Giovanola, who introduced a unique track design and train design featuring 4-across seating, or should I say, standing. The designers at Giovanola who worked on this ride were named Walter Bolliger and Claude Mabillard. We'll see them a bit more in a later video. Intamin had been working with Giovanola since 1984 on their bobsled coasters, the first of which opened at Six Flags Magic Mountain as Sarajevo bobsleds before being relocated to Six Flags Over Texas, where it stands today as La Vibora. 1 year later in 1985, Mach Rides, a German manufacturer most well known at the time for making powered family coasters, debuted their own bobsled coaster at Europa Park in Germany, thus firmly entering the steel coaster battleground. 1984 also saw Vekoma unleash one of the most popular coaster models ever, a triple looping shuttle coaster called the Boomerang, featuring a vertical loop, a double looping element called a Cobra Roll, and 2 116-foot spikes all packed into a compact footprint. The ride was a hit with both small and big parks alike. 4 Boomerang models opened in 1984, including Boomerang at La Ronde and Sea Serpent at Morris Piers in New Jersey, and over 50 have been built since. So it's been a minute since we talked about Schwarzkopf, but don't worry, he was still around. In 1985, Schwarzkopf crammed the 3-inversion looping coaster into Galaxyland, a park located in Alberta, Canada's West Edmonton Mall, and in doing so created one of the most extreme coasters ever built. To close out the decade, Schwarzkopf built what many consider to be his masterpiece. Named Olympia Looping, the ride is the world's largest operating transportable coaster, and is a famous fixture on the German fair circuit, often acting as the star attraction at Munich's Oktoberfest. As the 80s drew to a close, Arrow was ready to take the looping coaster to the extreme. And, unsurprisingly, Kings Island was there to act as Arrow's testing ground. In 1987, Kings Island opened Vortex, an Arrow looper with a record 6 inversions. The next year in 1988, Arrow beat their own record with Shockwave at Six Flags Great America. The ride was a monster, featuring a ludicrous 7 inversions and a height of 170 feet. 2 more of these massive Arrow loopers opened in the coming years: Great American Scream Machine at Six Flags Great Adventure, and Viper at Six Flags Magic Mountain. At this point, coasters were pushing 200 feet, and steel coaster manufacturers were getting more and more bold with their designs. The coaster boom of the 70s and 80s would continue into the new millennium, where both theme park chains and ride manufacturers would duke it out to see who could build the tallest, fastest, and most extreme roller coaster. The Coaster Wars was on the horizon, and the battle would be fierce. Hey everyone, thanks so much for your support over the past couple of months. It's crazy to think we're nearing the 1,000 subscriber mark. Let me know in the comments below what you thought of the video or the coasters in it. And if you made it this far, why not leave a like? It really helps support the channel. Until next time, thanks for watching.